Canada's Prime Minister just told the world that China has become a more predictable partner than the United States.
Not a fringe politician, not an opposition voice. Mark Carney, the elected leader of America's closest ally, longest border, and largest trading partner.
Behind that statement sits $130 billion in trade, a strategic partnership signed in Beijing on January 16, 2026, and a calculation so cold it has no politics in it at all. Canada didn't betray America. America built a spreadsheet that made this decision inevitable, and then handed Canada the pen. By the end of this explainer, you will understand the exact structural logic that moved a G7 nation from Washington to Beijing, and why Japan, South Korea, and the entire NATO core are quietly running the same numbers right now. You're watching Voice on Pages, where capital logic replaces capital noise. Subscribe if you think in systems.
To understand how we actually arrived here, we need to forensically examine the underlying numbers driving these shifts. If you look at 2024, the total two-way merchandise and services trade volume between Canada and China reached 130.9 billion Canadian dollars. That volume quietly cemented Beijing as Ottawa's second-largest single-country trading partner long before any new agreements were drafted. The mathematical weight for a major structural pivot was already sitting right there, just waiting for the right catalyst to activate it.
That catalyst ultimately arrived in the form of a relentless, measurable economic squeeze originating from Washington. The United States enacted a blanket tariff trigger of 25% on non-SUSMA goods, which rapidly crystallized into a 5.9% effective rate across the board by October 2025. The export damage was swift, and it was surgical. Steel shipments dropped by 24%, forestry fell by 8%, and aluminum volumes contracted by 15% in short order.
This wasn't just a temporary dip in quarterly profits, but a systemic fracture in a long-standing economic relationship. The Bank of Canada ran the numbers and projected a 0.9% permanent cut to the nation's potential output by 2027, driven directly by these trade tensions. It's essentially like a supplier whose oldest and best customer suddenly keeps changing the terms of their contract without warning. Eventually, that supplier is going to pick up the phone and call their second-largest customer to negotiate a much longer, more stable agreement.
That metaphorical phone call culminated in a definitive mathematical move that altered the geopolitical landscape. On January 16, 2026, a comprehensive strategic partnership was formally signed in Beijing. This wasn't born out of some sudden ideological alignment, but as a completely inevitable response to the pure calculus of global trade.
The actual mechanics of this agreement are striking, especially when you contrast the old barriers with the newly negotiated rates. Previously prohibitive 100% tariffs on 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles were entirely reversed, dropping down to just 6.1%. In return, China slashed its duties on Canadian canola from a punishing 84% down to a highly competitive 15%. These immediate tariff reversals effectively unlocked $3 billion Canadian dollars in agri-food exports alone.
The overarching goal, formalized in this new framework, is a 50% export growth to the Chinese market by the year 2030. When pressed to explain this profound shift, the phrasing chosen by Canadian leadership was incredibly precise. Prime Minister Mark Carney simply stated that Beijing had become more predictable, leaning entirely on the framing of a new, undeniable economic reality.
The founder of Voice on Pages, Nitin Tyagi, wrote "Stop Being Busy" after years reacting to emergencies, never reading the structural problem underneath. Canada read the structure. The structure said, Beijing.
If we step back and look at the architecture of this pivot, it becomes clear exactly who laid the foundation for it. Washington actively tariffed its closest ally while simultaneously threatening to annex its territory, which introduced significant volatility into the North American market. Capital inherently prices in predictability to survive, and it invariably flees from unpredictability.
But you have to remember, a sovereign nation cannot simply pivot hundreds of billions of dollars overnight without having the proper financial infrastructure already in place. The truth is, the plumbing for this exact scenario was built a decade ago. A 30 billion Canadian dollar Yuan swap line was established back in 2014, and Toronto was designated as North America's first Yuan hub the very next year. What we witnessed in 2026 was simply Ottawa finally wiring its export economy directly into a dormant yet fully functional system.
And the system they're wiring into is rapidly decoupling from Western financial dominance. China has already successfully moved 30% of its entire global trade settlement into its own currency, the yuan. Capital doesn't follow safety, and it certainly doesn't follow loyalty. It follows logic, and the logic here points squarely toward an alternate, functional financial ecosystem.
To prove this isn't just an isolated North American phenomenon, we only need to expand our scope across the globe. India is currently running the exact same systemic calculations regarding its own economic sovereignty. They are independently arriving at the very same mathematical conclusions as their counterparts in Ottawa, even if they are broadcasting it quite as loudly.
Despite publicized diplomatic frictions in recent years, the underlying trade reality tells a completely different story. India and Canada saw their bilateral trade hit $23.6 billion in 2024. More importantly, that figure represents a 10% year-on-year growth, proving that economic necessity tends to override political theater.
This fits perfectly into India's broader, quiet diversification architecture. The United Nations ranks them third globally for export diversification, and they are executing this strategy with incredible precision. They've operationalized direct rupee settlement mechanisms with the UAE and Russia, recently paying for 1 million barrels of Emirati oil entirely in rupees. Canada said it aloud on January 16th, but India is saying it quietly, one specific trade deal at a time.
What all of this data reveals is a fundamental shift happening in the global order. Canada is not an anomaly, nor is it acting alone. It is merely the first major domino to fall openly, and what is clearly a widening global contagion of capital realignment.
We can visually prove this by looking at the recent trade volumes of America's closest defense and treaty allies. Over an 11-month span across 2024 and 2025, the European Union ran up $767 billion in trade with Beijing, driven by Germany, France, and Italy all buying more. South Korea hit $328 billion, and Japan reached $292.6 billion. Consider that South Korea has 28,500 U.S. troops on its soil, yet China remains its absolute largest partner. The most critical security partners of the United States are simultaneously running up indispensable trade volumes with the exact competitor they are supposedly containing.
The mathematical reality of this dynamic is incredibly stark. While the United States exports to China fell by 20%, total Chinese exports globally actually went up by 5.5%. Consequently, China's trade surplus hit an astonishing $1.19 trillion. The rest of the world simply stepped in to fill the gap left by Washington, and they did it without hesitation.
This long-cycle shift might feel unprecedented, but history provides a very clear anchor for what happens when a primary security guarantor turns inward. We have seen major allies forced to radically alter their trade architecture to survive before. The inevitability of this realignment is written directly into the historical record. Just contrast the slow post-Suez decline of Britain in 1973, which took 12 grueling years of negotiation to finally lock into the European Economic Community. Compare that to the rapid, spreadsheet-driven pivot of modern Canada. Faced with the raw data, it took Ottawa just one comprehensive trip to Beijing in 2026 to firmly secure its economic future. We no longer have to speculate about what a post-dollar trade architecture looks like, because the established facts show the bloc already exists. We have $130.9 billion in hardened bilateral trade, an active Yuan hub functioning in Toronto, a finalized strategic partnership, and a locked-in 50% export growth target. The rest of the alliance is watching closely, and their spreadsheets are wide open.
The founder of Voice on Pages has written a book called Stop Being Busy, about what happens when you stop reacting to headlines and start reading structural problems. It is on Kindle, link below.
Because in the end, capital doesn't have loyalty. It has logic.